Kaiser Family Foundation study. We've got lots of information, and you can click on charts that I helped put together.
Marilyn G. Wax, National Public Radio, serves as our national economics correspondent. Thank you. We now go to the House of Representatives.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., December 15, 2011. I hereby appoint the Honorable Renee L. Elmers to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 5, 2011, the Chair will now recognize members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. James Surecki outdid himself in the current issue of the New Yorker's financial page as he contrasted the decision of American Airlines to take bankruptcy versus the expectation of American business for how homeowners should behave. It wasn't that American Airlines couldn't pay its bills with $4 billion in cash. It's just that it would be in a stronger position if it took advantage of the bankruptcy laws, where, working with a bankruptcy judge, it could restructure union contracts, pension plans, and bank loans to its advantage. For example, it's perfectly acceptable and legal for a judge to reset the current value of an asset and to permit loans with high interest rates to be set at current market. Unfair as it may seem to people who made the loans, it was part of the principle of bankruptcy to allow people to not be mired hopelessly in debt, but to start again under existing market conditions. It's part of what keeps our economy vital, keeping people not tethered to the mistakes of the past or bad luck, even if those mistakes were self-inflicted. Contrast this with what business expects from the 25% of homeowners whose mortgages are underwater, where the financial institutions have argued about the responsibility of homeowners to avoid the stigma of defaulting, that it was their duty and obligation to pay, even if it was financially irrational and extraordinarily difficult. He pointed out that the Mortgage Bankers Association, at the same time it was exhorting homeowners to hang in there and keep paying their loans, even if their mortgage was underwater, that it walked away from a $75 million loan on its headquarters, sticking the lender with a $34 million loss on a short sale. But he missed the real outrage, the expectation where homeowners under bankruptcy simply cannot do what American Airlines and other American businesses can do. Homeowners under law cannot take bankruptcy and have a judge reset the loan value of their residence to conform to what the current value is and to reduce the interest rates to reflect today's record low rates. That would have been the onerous, quote, cram-down provision so vigorously resisted by banks and financial institutions when we were discussing bankruptcy reform. Do as we say, not as we do. As a result, we have what I think is truly an insane situation where a speculator could buy 6 units in a condominium building and have a bankruptcy judge reduce the loan's amount and interest rate on each one of the speculator's 6 units, but the poor soul who bought his unit just to live in it cannot have that same privilege. If there was bankruptcy equality for homeowners, I don't think we ever would have had the financial bubble in the first place. You can bet that the masters of the universe that poured billions of dollars into secured mortgages would have been more careful if they knew that homeowners would have been treated the same way as a business and could have had unfair, onerous provisions modified under bankruptcy. This is one of the reasons why the Occupy Wall Street people are so outraged. This dual standard, telling homeowners to stay the course while large businesses don't. Fighting for the change under law under the guise of reform, which made it impossible for homeowners to be treated as well as speculators. If some of our friends on Wall Street are perplexed about the frustration and the outrage, they might look in the mirror. Maybe, just maybe, this is something that the Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party advocates can agree upon.
Fired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Brown, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I rise to commemorate the 220th anniversary of the adoption of the Bill of Rights to our U.S. Constitution. Some of our most basic freedoms and governing principles are laid out in this precious document. The amendments listed were meant to protect our individual liberty and our private property. They serve as a constant reminder that our nation was meant for its citizens to have liberty with very little government intrusion into their lives. Today's modern government has so sadly strayed very far away from the vision that our Founding Fathers had when they ratified the Bill of Rights. It seems like every day we lose a little bit more of our freedom to the ideals of big government and to the standards of socialism. In Hosea 4:6, God says, "My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge." We have a tremendous lack of knowledge in this nation about the principles that our Founding Fathers gave us in the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And we're being destroyed because those foundational principles are being eroded day by day here in Congress, by presidents, and by the federal court system. Please read the U.S. Constitution. Read the Bill of Rights. Teach them to our children and our grandchildren so that we can come together and demand a constitutionally limited government as our Founding Fathers intended. We need to begin to rebuild the principles that has made this nation the greatest in history, the greatest political experiment in the history of mankind. Those principles are what have made this country so great, so powerful, and so successful. And the only way that we will retain that is if we become knowledgeable and start demanding constitutionally limited government as our Founding Fathers meant it. So please read the Constitution. Please read the Bill of Rights. Read what our Founding Fathers said about it. Demand that kind of governance from our elected representatives all across this country at all levels of government. Our freedom and liberty depends upon it. Thank you. God bless you. God bless America. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
Okay, Mr. Neal. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
It's a little bit more closer to me if you could. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about a program that's set to expire at the end of the year if Congress does not act, and it's the New Markets Tax Credit Program. I have fought for this initiative since its enactment in 2000 because it's a cost-effective way to create jobs and drive investment in communities with high rates of poverty and unemployment. I've seen the amazing results of this initiative firsthand back home in Massachusetts, and today I want to highlight one of those Massachusetts projects, the Colonial Theater in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Let me tell you a little bit about the New Markets Tax Credit. The program was designed to stimulate investment and economic development in low-income communities that are traditionally overlooked by conventional capital markets. The New Markets Tax Credit program attracts capital to low-income communities by providing private investors with a 39% federal tax credit for investments made in business or economic development projects located in certain areas with individual poverty rates at least 20% of where median income is low. According to the General Accounting Office, 88% of the New Markets Tax investors said that they would not have made the investment in a low-income community without New Markets Tax credits. Every project or business financed by New Markets Tax credits is located in a low-income community or has benefits of low-income individuals. The vast majority, over 90% of investment dollars generated through New Markets, has gone to communities with levels of economic distress that far exceed the minimum requirements of the law. And 60% has gone to communities with very high unemployment rates that are at least 1.5 times the national average. Through 2009, New Markets cost the federal government, in terms of lost revenue, less than $4 billion. That $4 billion is and should be treated as a government investment because it has resulted in $50 billion in capital projects in those low-income communities and created or retained an estimated 500,000 jobs. According to the Treasury Department, every $1 of foregone tax revenue under New Markets leverages $12 of private investment in distressed communities. That is results, in my opinion. Unfortunately, New Markets is a temporary program, and unless Congress acts this month, it will expire on December 31st. I am and have been the lead Democratic sponsor of legislation to extend this program for 5 years, and I've been leading the charge for years to make this a permanent initiative. I once again call on our colleagues to extend New Markets. Let's talk about the success of New Markets in Massachusetts. Over 170 businesses in Massachusetts have received New Markets financing. Hot Mama's Food in Springfield, the River Valley Market in Northampton, the Holyoke Health Center, and now the High Performance Computing Center in Holyoke as well. But I want to focus today on the Colonial Theater in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. Pittsfield is a city in western Massachusetts with a population of about 42,000 people. It's the largest community in that region of the state. It has struggled with unemployment and urban blight. The Colonial Theater is a rare architectural gem and one of the great acoustical houses in the world, located in the heart of Pittsfield. It was built at the turn of the century, and it was closed for more than 50 years. Periodic attempts to redevelop the theater failed for lack of money and sustained public support. However, thanks to New Market Tax credits, financing of $16.7 million of a total project cost of $21 million, this 70,000 square foot theater and adjacent building were magnificently restored. With 823 seats, the theater reopened in 2006 and now features an impressive lineup of plays and musical shows. James Taylor is currently performing at the Colonial Theater as part of a cast of A Christmas Carol. Since its renovation, the theater has hosted Arlo Guthrie, the Four Tops, and Bob Weir of the Grateful Dead will perform this spring. Recent musicals include The Who's Tommy, The Producers, The Wizard of Oz, and Rent. After the first 2 years of operation, the independent research firm Center for Creative Community Development estimated that the Colonial Theater sustains a direct economic impact of $4 million annually and 100 full-time jobs in the Berkshire area. The Colonial Theater is a symbol of the reemergence of Pittsfield as an economic and cultural center of the Berkshires. Anchoring the city's comprehensive strategy for downtown revitalization, the restored and vibrant Colonial Theater, along with the 6-screen Beacon Cinema Complex, also financed with New Markets Tax credits, has created jobs, attracted new businesses, spurred residential development, and added vitality to this city. Widespread street-level vacancy in downtown Pittsfield has been virtually eliminated, and 45 new businesses and restaurants have opened. The restoration has helped
The
to
gentleman's
attract
time
an
has
estimated
expired.
400,000 new visitors to downtown Pittsfield. Let's rejuvenate the New Markets Tax Credit Program.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Madam Speaker. Today I'm happy to announce that Company C, 150th Aviation United of the West Virginia National Guard are on their way home to their families and should arrive this afternoon after serving our nation for the past 12 months in Kosovo. Truly, there not could be a better Christmas present. Company C is based in the 1st District of West Virginia in my hometown of Wheeling and was deployed 1 year ago to Kosovo on a peacekeeping mission. While overseas, the unit was responsible for all aerial operations within their area of responsibility. Company C soldiers logged 2,899 flight hours and 951 missions. They ran multiple mechanical inspections and refueling missions and dispensed 246,260 gallons of fuel. The West Virginia National Guard plays a key role in the defense of our country and interests around the world. America could not be prouder to have these men and women as our representatives. Today, I'm thrilled to say, welcome home, Company C. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yesterday, we passed a defense authorization bill. That defense authorization bill had a 1.6% increase for our military personnel. That was an appropriate thing for us to do. However, at the same time, we are looking at reducing very substantially the pay and benefits available to our civilian federal employees. Madam Speaker, I rise out of a deep concern that this Congress continues to ask one group to sacrifice to bring down our nation's deficit while not asking others to contribute as well. That one group are average working Americans. Now, they work for the federal government, some perhaps the state and local governments, and there is an antipathy towards government by many of the public, many members of this House. And that antipathy is therefore focused on the workers. But we have substantially less federal employees today than we had 20 years ago, not only in terms of real numbers, but in terms of per capita, where the population has substantially expanded and the number of federal employees per person to be served has been substantially reduced. With all the challenges we face today on a national scale, we ought to ensure that those who help devise solutions and carry them out receive the recognition they are due. We talk a good game on this floor, but very frankly, we turn it over to employees to carry out our policies. We don't do that. They do it. They should not be constantly subjected to the kind of verbal attacks and legislative assaults we have seen over the past couple of years and that are included in the bills that have passed this House just this past week. I am speaking, of course, about America's public servants. Those who work in civilian government positions are no less important to our safety, health, prosperity, and general well-being as their military counterparts who protect our freedom. I honor our troops. I'm going to be wearing a yellow ribbon later today to welcome home those troops who have fought to protect our country, defeat terrorists, and stabilize the international community. They have blessed America with their courage and their commitment and their service. But federal civilian employees make certain that the products we buy and prescription drugs we use are safe. They perform critical research to advance the fight against cancer and other diseases. They help our farmers and ranchers access new markets for their goods. They see millions of passengers travel safely across our skies and keep watch over our ports and border crossings. They ensure a fair playing field for banks and businesses and enforce the rules we have in place to preserve the health of our air and water from pollution. So many of the public functions we often take for granted are the purview of the hard-working men and women who constitute our federal workforce. They're middle-class Americans, working Americans, who have in many cases chosen to serve their country by lending their talents and skills, some for a short time, others for their entire careers. As an American, I am proud of the work they do, and as a member of Congress from Maryland, I am proud to represent a great number of them in this House. But for those who believe that most of, or even a significant number of our federal workers live here in Washington, Maryland, and Virginia, let me set the record straight. 85% of federal employees live somewhere other than the Washington metropolitan area. 85%. They provide essential services to neighbors and communities in all 50 states and every single one of our districts. While everything must be on the table when addressing the budget, and by the way, I put on the table a zero COLA adjustment 2 years ago, sitting in the White House around the table, having talked to leaders of our federal employees and said, look, we need to tighten our belt. Americans are having trouble. We have a lot of our neighbors out of work. We need to tighten our belt, and we took a 0%. Taking it 2 years in a row. $60 billion contribution already by federal employees. $60 billion, while we say we can't raise a nickel of additional taxes from the most well-off in America. But we can take $60 billion from average working men and women in this country. Everything must be on the table. I'm deeply disappointed, however, that we continue to attack these public servants unfairly and single them out. Now, when I say we, the Republican bills that have been offered on this floor and have been discussed. When middle-class families across the country are struggling to make ends meet, federal employees have already accepted two-year pay freeze. That was appropriate. That was acceptable. But continuing assault from just one segment is not. This comes on top of salaries that are already lower than those for comparable private sector jobs. Let me repeat that, because there is a prejudice that somehow federal employees are vastly overpaid. In fact, the Federal Salary Council's annual report last month found that federal workers are paid on average 26.3% less than comparable private sector jobs. Now, some people don't understand that, because what we ask our federal employees to do requires, for the most part, high skills. We have a lot of engineers, scientists, doctors at NIH, at Goddard NASA, in the FBI, highly skilled, highly educated people. 26.3% differential in pay for comparable work that is done in the private sector. Now, most of you many of you are sitting there, and perhaps our viewers say, oh, no, that's not true. I know it's not true, because I see what the average salaries are. What they don't see is the average requirements for skills. Madam Speaker, America's public servants are already making a contribution because they love this country and recognize that when times are tight, everyone has to pitch in, even the best off in America. A belief in smaller government does not grant one license to diminish the contribution made by those who serve in government. If we cut government, we need less people to run it. That makes sense. But what does not make sense is to undermine the ability to recruit and retain the quality of people that we need to continue to make this country, along in partnership with the private sector, the greatest country on the face of the earth. We must always remember that we are blessed, as Lincoln said, with a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. That this is us together, the one who serves and the one who benefits from that service. It is the bond of a neighbor and that of a fellow American. Let us remember that. Yes, we need to notch the belt in a notch. We need to make sure that we are on a fiscally sustainable path. But let us do so in a way that has everybody contribute, not just an unfavored few who serve us well. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. One of the items of unfinished business remaining to this Congress is extending the payroll tax cut of last year that funds Social Security. It is an inframarginal tax cut, meaning that it doesn't change economic incentives and therefore it doesn't produce lasting economic growth. But it does provide great relief to working families, allowing them to keep more of their earnings at a time of declining incomes, shriveling assets, and rising prices, and it should be extended. But it must be extended responsibly to avoid doing further damage either to the economy or to the Social Security system that this tax supports. That means we have to make up the lost revenue. Now, the Democrats have said, well, no problem, just tax the rich. In fact, they say that a lot. The problem is that the tax increases they propose are marginal tax increases, precisely the kind of tax increase that does enormous damage to the overall economy. Remember, more than half of net small business income would be subject to their tax increase at precisely the moment when we're depending upon those small businesses to create 2/3 of the new jobs that our people desperately need. Now, the measure passed out of the House this week also does far more harm than good. Unfortunately, the House added $167 billion to this year's already crushing deficit, mostly to pay for the payroll tax cut, purporting to repay 1 year's tax relief over the next 10 years. And how does it do that? Well, in part, it tacks on additional fees to mortgages backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This shifts the burden to home buyers, who will end up paying far more in new taxes that are now hidden in their mortgage payments than they'll ever get back from the tax cut. True, under the House version, the average family will save $1,000 in payroll taxes, but if that family takes out a $150,000 mortgage backed by Fannie or Freddie, they'll end up paying an extra $3,000 as a result of this bill. $1,000 of tax cuts for $3,000 of extra mortgage payments. Put more bluntly, the House version kicks the housing market when it's already down, making it that much more expensive for home buyers to re-enter that market, and adding to the pressures that have chronically depressed our home values. Worse, the House version would turn Fannie and Freddie into tax collectors for the general fund. If the House bill is enacted, we will have constructed a cash machine for government with an adjustable knob. And given the insatiable appetite of this government, the odds are far greater that knob will be turned up and not down in coming years. Ironically, one of the reasons to continue the payroll tax cut is because of shrinking family assets, mainly the value of their homes. The House version adds to the downward pressure on their home values while telling them we're doing them a favor, some favor. Fortunately, there is a way to extend the payroll tax cut, protect the Social Security system, and avoid doing further harm to the economy. And that's the measure offered by Mr. Landry of Louisiana, H.R. 3551. That bill was given short shrift in the House last week, and that's a shame. Mr. Landry's bill would give every American the choice to receive the year of tax relief in exchange for delaying their retirement by a month. According to the Social Security chief actuary, this would pay for itself. It would give every family in America the choice of deciding for itself whether the benefits of the tax cut are worth the cost of working a month longer. It would provide tax relief for those families that need it without doing harm to the Social Security system that the tax supports, and without shifting the burden to pay for it to home buyers, as the House version does, or to job creators, as the Senate version would have done. It's not too late to fix this problem the right way, and I would strongly urge the House to take Mr. Landry's bill more seriously in the closing days of this session. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today is the 220th anniversary of the passage of the Bill of Rights. It was declared Bill of Rights Day by Franklin Roosevelt back in the 40s, and it's an anniversary too often overlooked. Ken Paulson, the president of the First Amendment Center in Nashville, Tennessee at Vanderbilt University's campus, and the American Society of News Editors recently wrote that the Bill of Rights is a document that guarantees core personal liberties, including freedom of expression and faith, a fair judicial process, the right to bear arms, and protection against unreasonable government seizures. Yet almost no one takes time to reflect on the importance of December 15th, the anniversary of these fundamental freedoms, particularly in what they really are. That's why I wanted to come to the well today and spend a few minutes reflecting on this amazing document and the freedoms that we derive from it. It's easy to take our Bill of Rights for granted. Of course we have the right to speak our minds. We don't live in fear that the police will break down our doors without exigent circumstances or a warrant. It would be ridiculous to imagine a Church of America to which we all must belong and to which we must worship according to its dictates. But you only need to look across the globe to the Arab Spring and elsewhere to see millions of people protesting and risking their lives just to have a taste of the freedoms we take for granted, and you realize how fortunate we are. When the Constitution was ratified, there were very few individual rights guaranteed. It was mostly about setting up the structure of government. But Thomas Jefferson and others argued that the Bill of Rights was necessary to protect individuals from government. Think about how wise the founders were to ensure that the very government they were establishing would not encroach on certain fundamental liberties of the people. As Jefferson wrote in a letter to James Madison, a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth. Since Jefferson was not part of that constitutional convention, James Madison took up the task of drafting the Bill of Rights. After much debate and compromise, 10 amendments were approved and added to the Constitution. Right at the very beginning, we find the bedrock of the Bill of Rights, the great five freedoms of the First Amendment. Religion, freedom of speech, press, to peacefully assemble and petition the government. Those are the most basic freedoms we have, but they're not always without controversy. From the so-called war on Christmas to government-led prayer in school, we continue to debate what the free exercise of religion in the Establishment Clause meant. And that is not new. Thomas Jefferson found himself deep in the war over religious liberty as well. In response to attacks he was insufficiently religious, he wrote in a letter to Benjamin Rush, "For I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." He went on to explain in his famous letter to the Danbury Baptist that there is a wall of separation between church and state, since religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God. But that does not put the issue to rest. We continue to wrestle with these issues today. But the Bill of Rights, particularly the First Amendment, is what enables us to work our differences out peacefully through the democratic process. We have the right to speak our mind without fear that the government will stifle dissent. We have the ability to hold our government accountable with a vibrant free press, because an informed citizenry is what keeps democracy strong. And we have the right to protest when we're dissatisfied with our government. Whether actions by the Tea Party or the Occupy movements, the people are exercising their right to assemble and petition their government for redress of grievances. As elected officials, it's up to us to consider their causes while also protecting their rights. I remember back in 1993 when I was a Tennessee state senator. And one week I stood on the legislative plaza and I defended the Second Amendment, urging the passage of Tennessee's right to carry bill. And the next week I was on the plaza supporting a woman's right to choose, which comes through the Ninth Amendment. No two people at either of those rallies were the same. They were indeed very different. But what they were advocating was both in the Bill of Rights, and both supported such, and the Bill of Rights supported them. I've devoted much of my career to fighting for fairness in our criminal justice system. It's the Bill of Rights that builds fundamental issues into that system, particularly the Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments. It guarantees we'll have a reasonable bail, a fair chance to prove our innocence, have a lawyer, be able to question witnesses, and if convicted, we won't be subject to torture or other cruel and unusual punishments. The Bill of Rights embodies the core values of this nation: freedom, fairness, justice, and equality. We need to remember, though, that we've not always upheld those values. For example, the Fifth Amendment guarantees that we won't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. But many of the same people who drafted the Bill of Rights and the Constitution owned slaves, treated them as property, and gave them no rights whatsoever. It took almost 100 years to abolish slavery. and then another to get beyond the Jim Crow laws that continued such. We must honor the Bill of Rights and respect it for what it's done and recognize it today. I thank Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and others who gave us the Bill of Rights, and I swore upon the altar of God eternal hostility toward all forms of tyranny over the mind of man. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, when most people think of smuggling, they envision outlaws in the dark of night, lawlessly shuffling around guns and money to other outlaws. Most people would never imagine that the government of the greatest nation in the world would be engaged in a stealth smuggling operation by sending guns and money to narco-terrorists. It appears a group of people in the ATF and the DEA, all under the supervision of the Department of Justice, facilitated trafficking of guns and money to the drug cartels, the national enemy of Mexico and of the United States. These vicious cartels have inflicted terror on both sides of the border. They are literally at war with the Mexican people, the people to the south of us, our neighbors. First, we learned that the Justice Department, with the help of the ATF, apparently facilitated smuggling of over 2,000 weapons to the drug cartels. These guns included semi-automatic weapons and sniper rifles. People have died because of this activity. These weapons were used to kill at least 200 Mexican nationals and 2 U.S. agents. The Attorney General admitted to me in the Judiciary Committee last week, more people are going to die, all because our government is helping the drug cartels in Mexico obtain automatic weapons. Of the 2,000 weapons smuggled to Mexico, most are still unaccounted for. We don't know where they are. The Attorney General is the chief lawyer and law enforcement officer in the country, but he claimed last week in the Judiciary Committee he didn't know about Fast and Furious until recently. He either didn't read the memo or he didn't get the memo. What is more remarkable, Madam Speaker, he claims he doesn't know who authorized the smuggling ring. To coin a phrase from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the idea that Eric Holder, the head of the Department of Justice that oversaw this operation, was not involved or was unaware of what took place requires a willing suspension of disbelief. The question is there a rogue group of moles operating stealth activity in the Department of Justice? Apparently, no one really knows. The Attorney General also admitted last week that this operation was, in fact, reckless. It's worth noting, Madam Speaker, when a person recklessly causes the death of another person, it's the crime of manslaughter. If people under the Attorney General violated U.S. or international law, they need to be accountable for their actions. It's been almost a year since Agent Brian Terry was murdered, and when we first learned about this foolish operation, as we know now we call it Fast and Furious, Terry was killed by one of these smuggled guns to Mexico, but yet no one claims to know who's responsible. The second part of the rogue operation was the apparent laundering of money to the Mexican narco-terrorists, facilitated once again by the United States government. According to the New York Times report last week, undercover American narcotics agents from the DEA laundered or smuggled millions of dollars in drug money to the drug cartels. How many millions? No one knows. They allegedly handled the money on its path to the hands of the drug lords. This failed operation, like with the guns, was an effort to track the money and bring down the cartels. Of course, the cartels are as strong as ever. The administration claimed in a statement last week that it was working with the Mexican government in the operation on joint investigations to detect and dismantle money laundering networks. However, according to a spokesperson for President Calderon of Mexico, they had no idea the DEA was involved in this drug money laundering operation. The DEA and the ATF are under the control of the Justice Department. These disturbing operations facilitated the worst kind of result. They have resulted in people dying, and millions of money and hundreds of guns are unaccounted for. The drug cartels are the narco-terrorists. They are the enemy of Mexico and the U.S. They exist to obtain money and guns, and the United States help them get both. Somebody needs to go to jail. We need an independent counsel to investigate the Justice Department and the ATF. The Justice Department cannot be trusted to investigate themselves because the agency has lost credibility. Even Washington insiders responsible for Fast and Furious and laundry smuggling cannot hide from the long arm of the American justice system because, Madam Speaker, justice is what we do in this country, and that's just the way it is. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Rangel, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
I rise, Madam Speaker, to share with the House the importance of extended unemployment insurance, increasing disposable income, and to try desperately hard to shatter the myth that some of the opponents of extended unemployment have expressed. And that is that Americans don't want to work and would prefer to receive a check, and that receiving this check is a deterrent for them to go out and search for jobs. I can't believe that this is a Republican doctrine, because outside of these halls, most Americans don't wear on their sleeves, whether they're Republican or Democrats or liberals or conservative. Most Americans just want to be a part of this wonderful American dream. And while we work in order to have wages, so much a part of having a job is self-esteem. That's what our great country is about. Not since the Depression have Americans felt so embarrassed because their kids are being asked questions as to, did your daddy or mom lose your job? People who thought they made it into the middle class, which is the economic heartbeat of this great nation, moved into communities with higher rents or higher expenses in terms of their homes. And then they were hit by this economic nightmare through no fault of their own. They lost their jobs, their homes, their savings, their hope. And they're out there, and we are saying that they don't want to work, that they enjoy being unemployed. You know, this great nation has the Constitution as its foundation, but there's something that's not written there. And that is, if you can make your way to America, you can improve not just your status, but the status of your kids and your grandkids. Something has happened with this dream as it becomes a nightmare. And it has to do with disparity of the income. Because if you are born into poverty, chances of getting out of it in the United States of America is far less than in some other countries. That's not us. That's not what we believe in. And no one is asking for a class war. We're talking about a class in understanding the economy of this great nation. Less than 1% of Americans own 42% of Americans' wealth. And worse than being poor, more Americans who thought they reached the middle class wake up each and every day and find out that they're back into poverty. Can't we find some way to realize that this is not a party issue? This is the principles of the United States of America? Don't we know that these debates that we're having as to who can be the meanest and most ridiculous is causing us as a nation to lose the principles? And aren't these principles how do we treat the lesser of our brothers and sisters in this country? Isn't the question of how we treat our children, is that going out of the window? Our aged, our sick, and those in poverty? Isn't there something when middle-class people have to watch the cash register when they're paying out at the counter to make certain that they didn't pick up more than they can pay for? What about having your possessions put in the street for non-payment of rent? They're looking for unemployment compensation checks as a way of life? They have to explain this? No, we have to get back our dignity as a nation, and it doesn't include the gridlock that we have in the House of Representatives. Sure, getting elected is important, but fulfilling the American dream is far more important than anything this nation's based on. Yes, God bless America. Yes, in God we trust. Let's hope that God trusts us.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last week, 7 former Planned Parenthood employees wrote a joint letter to the Energy and Commerce Committee detailing the facts that many of my colleagues and I have long believed to be true. Planned Parenthood is grossly misusing taxpayer funds. These former employees revealed that clinic staff failed to properly follow correct billing procedures to prevent federal tax dollars from being used to fund abortion services as demanded by law. They outlined other horrific violations, including failure to properly notify parents when a vulnerable young girl may have been a victim of rape and is seeking an abortion. These former employees also wrote that abortion is indeed offered as a means of family planning in blatant violation of federal law. For years, we feared that Planned Parenthood was engaged in several of these abuses, and now we have inside information from brave folks who have confirmed these fears. In an effort to shed light on how much taxpayer money is at stake and to keep a promise I made to the people of Texas 22 when I was first elected, I requested a GAO report to give the public a full accounting of exactly how much federal money is sent to organizations that perform abortions each year. We learned that over a 7-year period, the taxpayer price tag to these organizations is almost $1 billion. And last week, I was further sickened to learn that, according to the former Planned Parenthood employees, between federal and state contributions, Planned Parenthood alone receives roughly $1 million per day of taxpayer funds. And yet, they're accountable to no one, including the taxpayers who morally oppose these funds being used to end an innocent life. I thank my Energy and Commerce colleague, Subcommittee Chairman Cliff Stearns, for launching an investigation into this matter, and I'm confident that the full committee will do a thorough audit of this corrupt organization. An investigation is sorely overdue. Madam Speaker, behind me is a picture of one of the largest Planned Parenthood clinics ever built. Tragically, it's located right outside of the district I represent in Houston, Texas. It's surrounded by 4 low-income minority neighborhoods, Planned Parenthood's target audience. This massive building has an entire floor dedicated to abortion services and rumored late-term abortions. And because of the 7 former Planned Parenthood employees, we know that doctors and clinic employees have illegally encouraged young girls to abort an unborn child as a means of family planning, all on our taxpayer dime. Americans should be outraged to learn of this horrific and possibly illegal use of their tax dollars. Planned Parenthood must be held accountable. I will continue to fight to cut off every single tax dollar that Planned Parenthood and similar organizations receive. We can never tire. We can never rest in our moral obligation to protect our nation's unborn children. Federal tax dollars are legally prohibited from being used for abortions. Under our Constitution, the Obama administration has a duty to enforce these laws. Under the same Constitution, the Congress has a duty to ensure that the executive branch follows the law of the land. I applaud those Americans who bravely raise their voices on behalf of innocent children who don't have one and maybe never will. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington, Mr. McDermott, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Madam Speaker, today we celebrate an action that took place 220 years ago when we passed the Bill of Rights. But I rise today to express my dismay at the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act yesterday. Not only did this bill curb our ability to keep America safe, it made a mockery of our constitutionally protected rights. But there is a larger point about the state of this country which is worth noting. Over the past several months, this body has wasted precious time writing a defense authorization bill with so many unsavory provisions, the President threatened to veto it. National security officials from all political spectrums condemned it as dangerous and unnecessary. In the end, the bill was watered down in response to many of the serious concerns about the bill, though it did not go nearly as far as it should. The final bill still contains restrictions on transfer of Guantanamo detainees and grants the President the power to indefinitely detain without trial American citizens in military custody. It shows just how far along the slippery slope our country has moved since 9/11 in authorizing sweeping powers to the President at the expense of our civil liberties. Let's be clear. The over-militarization of our counterterrorism efforts goes against American values and civil liberties, though some people continue to justify it through fear-mongering. We saw this after the horrific events of 9/11 when President Bush signed into law the Patriot Act that dramatically expanded law enforcement agencies' ability to search telephone, emails, financial records without a court order in the name of intelligence gathering. One section of the Patriot Act even allows the FBI to review library records to look at which books you're reading. In short, what we've done over the past decade is embrace national secrecy over national security. And the NDA bill took the Patriot Act to a whole new radical level. When the advocates of this bill don't seem to realize is that the American public is already paying a price in the name of keeping our nation safe. In September, the Center for Investigative Reporting and NPR conducted a joint investigation into private security at the Mall of America in Minneapolis. They found that the mall security personnel stopped an average of 1,200 people a year. Nearly two-thirds of those people belong to racial and ethnic minorities. Personal information from the suspicious activity reports from the mall were sent to the FBI, so they got an FBI file. Some of these people were reported for looking at the security guard in a, quote, suspicious way. An Army veteran was questioned for nearly 2 hours about a video he made inside the mall. One man left his cell phone on a table in the food court, and an FBI agent showed up at his family's home asking if they knew anyone who might want to hurt the United States. These intrusions create a chilling effect that causes law-abiding Americans to think twice about exercising their basic constitutional rights to speech and assembly. James Madison, as you heard, wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and he once said, quote, "The means of defense against foreign danger historically has become instruments of tyranny at home." That could not ring truer than yesterday. This is a sad day for our liberty and freedom when we give to the President. We may like the President, we may think he's a great man, but to give that office the power to hold Americans without trial in military custody indefinitely is eroding our right to a free trial and the ability to confront our accuser. Those things that are in that Bill of Rights are being taken away from all of us. Now we think it won't happen to me. Be careful. That's what people thought in a lot of other places in the world. And suddenly, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said in the German prison camps, and then they came for me, and there was no one to stand up. I yield back the balance of my time.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Wolf, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I was pleased this morning that the Washington Post did a story on a shameful development here in Washington, namely that Bart Fisher, a Washington lawyer, was granted a license by the Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, at Treasury to represent the genocidal government of Sudan. I submit a copy of the Post article for the record. The Sudanese people have long been brutalized, marginalized, and terrorized by their own government. And yet, unbelievably, it seems the same regime has been afforded the privilege of legal representation in Washington by the Obama administration. According to a news report earlier this week in Africa Intelligence, Mr. Fisher was hired with the express purpose of, quote, trying to lift American sanctions against it. The documentation posted on the Department of Justice website, it appears that Mr. Fisher was granted a license by the Office of Foreign Asset Control at Treasury to provide this representation, and that he plans to engage in political activities, among them, quote, representations including petitions to U.S. government agencies regarding sanctions, end of quote. I'm appalled that this has been permitted, and some wonder if Mr. Fisher's political contributions were a factor. The administration should reverse this approval. Martin Luther King famously said, quote, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. The Obama administration should remember the words, the silence of our friends. What must the people of Sudan be thinking at this particular juncture when the Obama administration struggles to find its voice on their behalf, while at the same time seemingly to empowering the voice of the oppressors? Bashir's crimes are well known and documented. This is the same man that is accused by the International Criminal Court of 5 counts of crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, torture, extermination, and 2 counts of war crimes. I've been to Sudan 5 times, including in July 2004, when Senator Sam Brownback and I were the first congressional delegation to go to Darfur. We spoke with women who had been raped just days earlier. The Arab Janjaweed militias, armed by Khartoum, the government of Khartoum of Sudan, told these women that they wanted to make, quote, lighter-skinned babies. In addition to horrific human rights abuses and crimes committed by Bashir and his National Congress Party, Sudan remains on the State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. It is well known that the same people currently in control in Khartoum gave safe haven to Osama bin Laden in early 1990s. Moreover, Khartoum was a revolving door for Hamas and other designated terrorist groups. But Bashir's crimes are not merely at the thing of the past. At a recent Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the crisis in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile states in Sudan, a former member of Congress and president of United to End Genocide, Tom Andrews, spoke about his experiences while visiting the region. He said there were reports of, and I quote, Sudanese armed forces and their allied militias going door to door targeting people based upon their religion and based upon the color of their skins. And yet the Obama administration gives them the right to have somebody in this town to represent them. A recent delegation from the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom visited Sudan and met with refugees in Yaita camp. They returned with similar reports. All the pastors with whom they spoke said they fled southern Kordofan after learning